Welcome to the family, son.
Well, it only took me a year, but I'm finally back. I think it's fair to say that horror games underwent significant changes in the 12 years between the release of Resident Evil 4 and Resident Evil 7. While there are still mainstream horror action games like subsequent Resident Evil titles, Dead Space and Silent Hill, the period also saw the rise of popular indie horror games such as Amnesia, Slenderman, SCP and countless others. These games made use of advancements in game engines that allowed for better lighting, sound design, enemy AI and object physics to put a much heavier emphasis on horror stealth. While it is always difficult to decide where the exact genesis of a particular genre lies, I don't think it would be too controversial to say that Frictional Games' Penumbra, a predecessor to Amnesia, is the granddaddy of the modern first-person horror experience. Though I will take a brief tangent to give some honorary mentions to games of the time that made use of similar technology to great effect, such as Doom 3 and the Shieldbridge Cradle mission in Thief Deadly Shadows. Penumbra, however, is where we start to see a lot of the brand new mechanics of the mid-2000s pulled together into a horror format that we would recognise today. I should say, to avoid confusion, that Penumbra is the name of the tech demo for Frictional Games' HPL engine released in 2006. If you've played a Penumbra game, it is likely Penumbra Overture, which is the full version of the game released in 2010. But since Overture is the full finished version of the game and story, I'm going to refer to it as Penumbra. With that out of the way, let's talk about the foundations that Penumbra laid down. While weaponless protagonists would come to typify most horror stealth games, Penumbra plays a much crueler trick. There are weapons and they do damage, but they have to be swung awkwardly from side to side by moving the mouse while holding left click. It's no surprise then that straight away at the beginning of the game, Penumbra tells you to avoid fighting at all costs. You use shadows to hide, throwable objects to distract enemies, and larger movable objects to block doors and other pathways that the enemy tries to follow you. Even if you do end up fighting, creatures take a long time to kill, like this time I had absolutely no choice but to kill a zombie wolf. Skulking in the shadows means that the player is often forced to look directly at the creature they're trying to avoid, taking note of its patrol path while also making sure they can't be seen. So the developers came up with another sneaky idea. If a creature gets too close while you're in snake mode, your character will start to panic, his breathing will get heavier, and the screen will shake.
Oh, go now. There is no time to explain. Well, in fact, time is one of the few things we have in abundance down here. What surprises I've spoiled by such catty curiosity.
Eventually, staring at the creature for too long will cause the player to involuntarily stand up. The only way to avoid this is to look away. So just to be clear, Penumbra asks you to avoid fighting enemies, hide in the shadows, and then look away as they prowl mere inches away from your hiding spot. This is genius game design. If the player is allowed to look at the creatures for too long, they'll stop being afraid of them. In time, the creatures will go from inciting dread to being mere irritants in the way of achieving the next goal in the game. But on top of this, by forcing players to look away from the creatures, they can never be completely sure which patrol path has been taken. Instead, they have to listen carefully and hope that they don't misjudge an enemy's position before leaving cover. For extra tension, the game also makes use of physics-based challenges during chase sequences and other moments of tension. I've seen some reviews of Penumbra that accuse these fiddly controls of being needlessly frustrating, but I have to disagree. It is janky for sure, but the tactility of the puzzles and the combat adds to the sense of panic and dread. Swinging wildly with ineffective weapons teaches the player that combat should be avoided, and trying to turn a handle or even close a door while being chased adds some weight to mistakenly turning the wheel the wrong way or not spotting an item to bar the door in time. Speaking of not managing to avoid fights, let me just Yep, still not dead. If anything, I'm a little disappointed that Frictional Games dropped combat altogether in Penumbra Black Plague and have never brought it back in any of their subsequent games. Then again, I also thought Machine for Pigs was good, so what do I know? Ultimately, while Penumbra wasn't necessarily the first horror game with a first-person camera, it certainly codified a lot of the tropes of first-person horror going into the early to mid-2010s. And I really should have edited this script and not have the word first so many times in one sentence. From an emphasis on avoiding enemies by keeping an eye on their movement, to panicked chase sequences that made use of the more intimate view of a first-person perspective, Penumbra showed just some of the ways that a change in camera style could offer different horror experiences to third-person and fixed-camera games. Many more games experimented with horror over the next few years, and while there were a lot of fantastic entries, including of course the masterful PT, the indie scene became stale with PT ripoffs and Five Nights at Freddy's clones. In addition to these games, I think players began to realise that sometimes hiding and running away from monsters felt, shall we say, unengaging. So then Alien Isolation came along and was like, hey, here's one of the most terrifying creature designs in film history, and trying to run away from them will get you killed. Okay, have fun. I don't want to talk about Alien Isolation for too long because I've rambled long enough, and I still need to talk about the other Resi series that caused the IP to fall apart quite significantly before the rise of Resi 7. But the reason I brought it up is it proved an interesting point. During the Penumbra Amnesia influenced period of horror, the belief started to emerge that having no weapon was the best way to disempower the player. And as much as I love all these games, I think Alien Isolation did a great job in showing that actually you can give your player an entire arsenal of weapons and still make them crap their pants. Just as an example, the stairway scene in Alien Isolation where you have the flamethrower and you have to pull all the levers is still terrifying, even though you have a weapon that can make the alien run away. I can appreciate all that Resident Evil 4 has done for the horror genre and even the genre of third-person action shooters, but I can't help but feel that the absolute shitstorms of Resi 5 and 6 are an inevitable end to the second trilogy if Resi 4 is their starting point. Let me explain. Even more so than Resident Evil Nemesis, Resi 4 reduced the number of puzzles and put a much stronger emphasis on action, to the point where the game often feels like an over-the-shoulder light gun shooter more than a horror game. But it isn't just the mechanics that remove most of the fear from Resident Evil 4. Most of the game is set during the daytime in brightly lit areas where the player has a long line of sight to enemies. Leon also has a lot of room to move around, with only a few sections involving cramped corridors and walkways or enemies surrounding the player. To be fair, I should probably mention that I'm playing Resident Evil 4 in this footage using a keyboard and mouse, which allows for much faster turning and smoother aiming. I don't know what it was like trying to control Leon Kennedy with one of these motherfuckers. The glut of action in Resident Evil 4 also necessitated the merchant and his plentiful supply of ammo, almost entirely removing the need for ammo conservation. I'm not trying to say I think Resident Evil 4 is a bad game. I enjoyed my playthrough and have happily watched some of my favourite YouTubers and Twitch streamers play the game as well. So why do I think it led to the series' demise? Well, for me, the best comparison is Terminator 2. Judgment Day is an amazing film, and while I personally prefer the first Terminator, I can understand why many people favour the second film. However, T2 set the Terminator franchise on a doomed path. If you're the writer, director of Terminator 3, or 4, or 17, or 52, which film do you try to emulate? The slow burn action thriller of Terminator 1 or the all-out action blockbuster of T2. Unfortunately, all subsequent Terminator films have found themselves caught in between the two, unable to recreate the magic of either of the first two installments. This is what happened to the Resi series after 4. Resi 4's reliance on action set pieces and waves of enemies, plus the simplifying of puzzles, led to Resi 5 and 6's developers feeling like they had to double down and turn everything up to 11, and mix their metaphors. And it's not just my crazy caffeine-addled brain saying this. In a behind the scenes for Resi 7, executive producer Jun Takeuchi talked about his time as producer in Resi 5, saying, "I was the producer of Resident Evil 5 and was in the position of following up RE4. It completely changed the gameplay style compared to the first three while still feeling like Resident Evil. It was an incredible game. So the theme for RE5 was asking ourselves how to build an RE4 and get as many people as possible to enjoy the game. And that meant that the scale inevitably became larger. We added various characters as well as co-op play. The game was designed to be bigger in every way. At this point I would be remiss not to mention the Resident Evil Revelations series as well. The same year that Resident Evil 6 came out, Capcom released a shorter spin-off game for console and Nintendo DS called Resident Evil Revelations, which was followed by Revelations 2 in 2015. These two games stand out as they managed to blend the over-the-shoulder improved gunplay of Resident Evil 4, 5 and 6 with a much more intimate survival horror of the original trilogy. Incidentally, I wonder what the Japanese is for survival horror.
Survival horror.
And clearly Takeuchi-san enjoyed them too, as one of the first things he did when put in charge of Resi 7's Alien production in 2014 was to make Revelations 1 director Koshi Nakanishi the director of Resi 7. So now that I've given the briefest of overviews of what was happening with horror as a genre and the Resident Evil series, let's finally jump into 7.
did you find this guy?
Give me a break, Pete.
Hey, I only work with professionals.
The team behind Resident Evil 7 certainly had their work cut out for them. They needed to react to the changes in the horror genre without losing the Resident Evil identity, while also acknowledging the legitimate criticisms of the most recent mainline entries in the series. They achieved this by stripping the gameplay back to its barest bones while keeping just enough to make the series' lineage clear. The effect of all this is that there is a layer of comforting familiarity running just under the surface of everything that is new. A new location, a new lead character, new mechanics, new art style, new camera. Right from the get-go it feels like a Resident Evil game that has had all the fluff and the camp and the convoluted multinational corporations removed. As the story unfolds, the writers are then able to drip feed in references to Raccoon City and Umbrella and eyeball monsters. Resi fans love eyeball monsters, it's a thing they're into.
Zoe! Get your head! Back to the house!
I'm gonna pull another quote from that behind the scenes video because it's a goldmine. Speaking of Takeuchi's plan in Resident Evil 7's early development, Nakanishi said, his concept was bringing horror back to the forefront, and he told me that the motif was Evil Dead. If you've seen that movie, you'll know it has a very intimate atmosphere. Set in one location, a remote cabin, and there's only 6 or so characters for the whole thing. The idea was to make a Resident Evil game as compact but deep as that. Given that setting plays a huge part in the atmosphere of The Evil Dead, it is perhaps unsurprising that it also plays a huge part in Resident Evil 7. While Sam Raimi's horror classic took place in a forest in Tennessee, Resi 7's backwater of choice is the Louisiana Bayou. More specifically, the setting is the Baker family estate. The estate works as a sort of twisted inverse of the Spencer mansion from RE1. Where the former was a European-style mansion, empty but mostly in working order, the Baker estate comprises a rundown plantation house and its various dilapidated outbuildings. Every building on the estate is covered in moss and grime and mould and rust. If you've ever rented from a dodgy landlord, then you can probably picture the kind of place I'm talking about. The kind of place where every room makes you feel like washing with bleach. And the setting works perfectly with the gameplay too. Being in first person, the horror is more intimate and more personal, and relies far more heavily on grossed out body horror than previous Resi games. So the levels themselves have to be unsettling to move through and exist in. Scenes like Mia cutting off Ethan's hand or Jack feeding you a forkful of whatever the flip aren't going to be as effective at getting under the player's skin if they're set in a pristine Edwardian home. You have to literally feel the tetanus seeping into your bloodstream. In fact, let's move on to talk about the ways Resi uses the first person camera, since I'm almost out of adjectives to describe broken down homes. From the moment Ethan arrives at the Baker estate, the game is utilising the new camera angle to its fullest potential. From thing jumps in your face jump scares, to oh god don't touch that object horror, to hey is that alleged sex offender Jared Leto in his makeup from the recent Gucci film? The sense of dread is something I personally haven't felt in a Resident Evil game in a long time. There are previous installments in the series where I worried about jump scares or monsters that move fast or took a lot of ammo to dispose of, but I've never felt like I actually wanted to turn the game off before. And that's when you know it's good horror, when you only feel safe by actually closing down the game. The exploration, puzzle design and combat also make regular use of the perspective shift. Consumable items are often hidden behind picture frames, under chests of drawers, and even in those weird mini vases that you find in gardens that are far too small to hold an actual plant. Needless to say, the player will have to think carefully about where 10 extra bullets or another pack of chem fluid might be hiding if they don't want to be regularly behind on resources. The Resi series has always expected players to manage resources and search for items, but most of the time these items were lit up like a Christmas tree or stood out as obvious 3D models against the pre-rendered background. The new system, however, really gives the feeling of scrounging and scavenging. Resources in Resident Evil 7 feel less like an item left behind by the developers, although obviously they are, and more like something you're stealing from the bakers, turning their own resources against them. One slight qualm I do have as regards exploration is the hidden treasures. At 3 points throughout the game, the player will stumble across these pictures that give clues to the whereabouts of special items. The only problem is, if you don't pick up the picture, you can't pick up the treasure, even if you notice something off about the environment. As an example, a player may notice that this stone sticks out from the fireplace, but clicking on it does nothing until the player finds the clue related to this treasure, at which point the stone falls away and the player is rewarded with a steroid injection that permanently increases maximum health. It is a minor thing, but it would have been nice to reward the curious. I haven't seen many reviews talk about the combat in RE7 other than making some pithy comments about Call of Duty once they get to the sections where Ethan has more guns. The implication here seems to be that if a horror game has weapons, suddenly it isn't scary, but this is absolute bollocks. There are several different emotions that can be evoked by any kind of horror media. There's terror, panic, fear, revulsion, dread, and horny. Out of all these, panic is the emotion you feel most when playing any kind of action game, but especially action horror. It's the feeling that you will fumble a button prompt or miss a shot and fail to stop the creature lumbering towards you. This can certainly be handled badly in horror. As I mentioned earlier, Resident Evil 4, 5 and 6 mostly gave the player too much time, ammo and space to deal with a wall of enemies. And in first person shooters, most players, especially mouse and keyboard players, will find aiming even easier. So Resident Evil 7 works around this by making the molded judder and twist and jerk and shake and lurch. Every time you think that you have a beat on them, there's always a chance they'll move just as you're about to shoot. And that's not even counting the crawling molded that skitter along the ground and do massive damage if they hit you even at lower difficulties. And the fastest way to take them out is to hit their very small headshot hitbox. Combine all this with small rooms, narrow corridors and the addition of a block button, it is clear that developers wanted the combat to be very literally in the player's face, keeping them in a constant state of panic as any missed shot could lead to a drooling, snarling monster flap filling up the screen. The first-person camera so fundamentally changes the way the player interacts with and experiences both the 3D space and the action, that Resident Evil 7 instantly elevates the series from fun survival horror action romp to genuinely one of the most uncomfortable and terrifying horror games in the modern era. By the way, if you're wondering what counts as the modern era, it's any game that came out after Honeypot. To complement the more intimate camera and level design, Resident Evil 7's story is also more personal and smaller in scale than previous Resi games, with the game only bringing in the wider story of corporate conspiracies and profit-driven experiments in the final third. A large part of the story is taken up trying to understand how Mia came to live with the Bakers, why the Bakers are the way they are, why they keep mentioning a gift given by their daughter Evelyn,
my little girl has given us a...
why they have mold creatures in the basement, and why this creepy old lady keeps following you around in her wheelchair. Most of these details are unveiled through the usual fare of cutscenes and documents, but the game also includes another method of story delivery which I think is worth talking about, and that is the VHS tapes. Early on in the game, Ethan finds a VHS tape titled Surrogators. If the player puts it in the VHS player, they get to play out the video with Clancy, cameraman for a Derek Acora style show about supernatural occurrences, but with fewer scousers.
Mary loves Dick. Mary loves Dick.
This first tape adds some backstory, sets up a few characters for later in the game, and most importantly, shows the player that there's a lever in the fireplace, which is a nice simple way of pushing the game forward without having an on-screen hint. After the first tape there are three more. One that follows Mia as she tries to escape Marguerite, one that catches up with the poor cameraman Clancy as he tries to escape Lucas's gender reveal party, and one final tape during Mia's scuttled ship section. There are two advantages afforded to the storytelling by the VHS tapes. The first is that they allow for a break in the pace and a change in the gameplay style. A great example of this would be the Clancy tape Birthday Party. In this tape the player must attempt to escape a death trap created by Lucas Baker by simply lighting a candle and a cake. The puzzle plays out a little bit like a point and click adventure meets, well, obviously an escape room. But crucially, because this puzzle involves a secondary character, it is able to end in Clancy's death. And this isn't just for shock value. Playing this tape allows the player to avoid Clancy's fate by learning the password to this door, meaning they don't have to unwind this key to wind up this doll so the oil never spills on the player or the cake room floor, meaning that when the cake is finally lit there's only a small explosion rather than a blazing inferno.
Motherfucker!
Without a VHS tape, the player would either have to have died once in order to solve the puzzle, which wouldn't have been much fun and would have been a little bit meta, or the developers would have had to set up the trap to be easily beatable garbage, which would somewhat fly in the face of the fact the game has been telling the player for the last few hours that Lucas is a mad genius and a brilliant engineer. The other advantage of the VHS tapes is that they allow the developers to tell aspects of the story out of order. In the final tape, and the only mandatory one, the player controls Mia one final time. This time, on the day that the tanker carrying Evelyn ran aground. It turns out that Mia was on the tanker as an agent for a shadowy organisation called the Connections. Their job was to transport the bioweapon Evelyn to a facility in South America. When a storm hits and the ship is run aground, several miles inland, Mia and Evelyn are found by the Bakers and taken in. In older Resident Evil games, and sadly the new one too, this information would have been delivered to the player through a long scene of expository dialogue. By allowing the player to play these memories through the in-universe reasoning of it being a recording, not only are they able to deliver the same information without interrupting the flow of the gameplay, but they're also able to get across Mia's genuine compassion for and fear of Evelyn, while also showing that Evelyn is just a scared child.
Now do you remember?
Yes, Evelyn. I remember.
Can we be a family like before?
No, Evie. We can't be a family. We were never a family. We will never be a family.
Then I don't need you anymore.
Across the board in Resident Evil 7, there's a much greater emphasis on the players empathizing with the antagonists. I know it isn't necessarily unique for Resident Evil games to humanize villains, but often this humanization involves some throwaway line like, oh, they only did it because their family died or whatever, presented as a half-ass excuse before they turn into a massive eyeball monster. Resi 7, on the other hand, goes out of its way to show that the Bakers were once normal people. Maybe I'm overthinking it, but I feel that Resident Evil 7 does the opposite of what many of the previous games do with regards to the portrayal of family. In past games they took a very gothic approach to families and lineage, especially in Resi 1, 0 and Code Veronica. By that I mean the use of gothic mansions and leaning into the trope that old moneyed families have deep dark secrets hiding in the crypts and the cellars. In Resident Evil 7, however, the story takes a family type that are normally portrayed as being psychopathic, i.e. the backwater hillbillies, and says that they were regular people before the infection, and in fact fell foul to Evelyn's control specifically because they took her in after the aforementioned storm. In one of my favourite scenes, Ethan has a flashback to when he was knocked out by Jack at the start of the game. It turns out that when Zoe was stapling Ethan's hand back on and giving him the off-brand Fitbit, Jack was in the room too. By this point, the player knows the truth about Evelyn. She is a biological weapon with psychic abilities which seems to spread through mold, and also grants powers such as the Baker's healing ability. The Bakers, however, do seem to retain some of the humanity akin to the sunken place in Get Out. In a genuinely great performance from Jack's voice actor, he describes what it's like to live with Evelyn in their minds and to do the things she tells them to do. Afterwards, he begs Ethan to put it right by finding a way to stop Evelyn and free his family.
Listen, the girl just wants a family of her own. She's the key, all right? You find her, and you stop her. Ethan, free my family. Please.
This scene more than any other emphasises the horror of what is happening to the Bakers. Horror as a genre isn't about jump scares and spooks and viscera. In fact, often relying on those things can make the horror genre come across as rote and uninteresting. Horror is about exploring the basic fears we all have through fantastical, hyperbolic means. The idea of being made to do things you don't want to do would be terrifying even if those things weren't violent crimes. As well as representing the fear of losing control, the Baker family could also be seen as a metaphor for toxic family dynamics. I think most people, even people who don't suffer from anger issues, have had moments where they made a snide remark to a loved one, or raised their voice when they didn't mean to. And I can imagine it must be much worse for people who have severe unwanted outbursts. To feel like something or someone has wormed its way inside your head and made you do things you don't want to do is a horrific thought. And in the case of Zoe, who we discover is mostly immune to Evelyn's mind control, we have the horror of having to live in a family dynamic that is slowly deteriorating, becoming more violent and hurtful and sadistic as Evelyn's pent-up rage manifests through them. Zoe most likely knows her real family are in there somewhere, but considering the things that they've now become, it is understandable she may feel conflicted about saving them. Tangential to all this Zoe talk is the game's only real choice. When Ethan has left the mansion and fought his way through Lucas's trap house, he has all the ingredients for a serum that can kill Evelyn. Zoe mixes the ingredients together, then tells Ethan there's only enough for 2 dosages. During the third and final boss fight with Jack, however, Ethan is forced to use one of the serums to kill Jack. This means that when he leaves to board a boat and escape, there's only one serum left to choose between Zoe and Mia. Choosing Zoe is technically the non-canonical choice, and either way you end up playing as Mia in the next section, but I feel that this choice wouldn't have had any meaning at all if not for the incredible characterization of Zoe and her relationship with the family. I personally chose Mia, but felt a genuine pang of guilt as I left Zoe in the dark, and that's what this choice is about. Resi 7 isn't pretending that it suddenly became a choice-driven RPG, it's just presenting the player with a choice that they may consider why the choice is being presented.
I'll send help.
Don't bother. There won't be anyone left to help!
I don't want to get into it too much because it's tangential to the point of the video, but this is probably the best place to bring it up. Mia should have been the main character. Through various videos, cutscenes, and even an entire playable chapter as her, we discover that Miss Winters has a considerably more interesting backstory than her husband. I know the game developers often create lead characters as blank slates so that the player can relate to them better, but I think that this is a flawed and out-of-date way of creating a protagonist. If people only wanted bland or likeable characters, then they wouldn't play games like Disco Elysium where you play a drunken mess of a failed cop, or Bioshock Infinite where you play a former Pinkerton, partaker in the massacre at Wounded Knee, and the actual villain of the game. That's all I have to say in the matter. Make Mia the lead character in Resi 9.
Both.
It's difficult to know how to finish these essays without devolving into TLDW, but I'll give it a go. It's not impossible to make another great Resident Evil in a third-person over-the-shoulder style. Hell, games like Medium have shown the fixed camera angles can still be done. Nonetheless, I'm really glad the Resi team decided to sew together some of the best staples of the series, trends in horror at the time, and even some inspiration from classics, into a fun game, a satisfying narrative, and a promising revitalization of a franchise. I will also give some kudos to Capcom who, flawed as they may be, are willing to take some risks with their biggest IPs. The more big name publishers that do this, the more it shows other publishers that risks can pay off. Of course, you should always bear in mind that these companies are not your friend, would bleed their own grandmother for a trickle of extra profit, and you should leave them in the dust the second you're tired of their manipulative and predatory nonsense. But until then, enjoy the good games. Thanks for watching. I know it may seem a bit weird to have a channel update when I have such a small channel, but I'm going to do one anyway. This video was supposed to be out almost a year ago. Then I kept putting it off and procrastinating, and then I got ill several times throughout the year. More than any of that though, I think I forced myself to do a video on a game just because I enjoyed it. I really liked playing Resident Evil 7, but in retrospect I don't know if I had much to say about it, and I personally think this video meanders quite a bit. When I started the channel back in June 2020, I initially planned on making one video a month. But I think it makes more sense now to only do videos when I feel like I genuinely have something to say about a game. So from now on, I aim to do between 6 and 12 videos a year, and hopefully I'll be able to improve the quality of my writing, editing and audio with each one. With all that said, my next video should be on Sekiro Shadows Die Twice, because that is a game where I feel like I genuinely do have a lot to say. Aside from that, I don't know, follow me on Twitter I guess, who knows, maybe I'll say something very witty and interesting. And again, thanks for watching.